the St. Lawrence River and came down, actually forced down by the Iroquois. The Lenape, the Delaware, were forced out of the New Jersey and Delaware River Valley by white settlers. The Shawnee came up from the south, and they were essentially kind of moved in initially themselves because they didn't want any other tribes or anyone living in the Kentucky area. The Miami came in from the west, and they were forced in by Plains Indian tribes, forcing them out of their original area. But the one thing that was kind of unique during this time is that the Iroquoian and Algonquin-speaking tribes, which these were, had a whole series of paths, Indian paths they used for trading amongst themselves, for hunting, for their own commerce, that were all throughout the Ohio Territory. And one of the most important ones, the whole thing is kind of referred to as the Great Trail, but there's one called the Tuscarora Path that goes from what is now Pittsburgh through the southern part of Columbiana County and the northern part of Carroll County. And that Tuscarora Path actually goes right along the Sandy, just north of our property there at Lake Mohawk, continued on to what is now Bolivar, and then went on up to Sandusky area. And that path became very significant because it ended up being the first road that was eventually built into the Northwest Territory. The second part of my little story, for better or worse, on the personal side, my own family on my mother's side, the Whitakers were among the first settlers into the Northwest Territory, into the Ohio Territory. And they came here from Virginia. In fact, my 3 times great uncle, a guy named John Whitaker, founded the town of Minerva, named it. And my 3 times great grandfather, his John Whitaker's brother, acquired one of the first farms right along the Carroll, Columbiana County border, what is Carroll and Columbiana County right now. It was a farm land that he purchased, surveyed by George Washington when he was a young surveyor. And that farm has stayed in our family until the 1950s. And the significance of that is the little story I want to relate to you. Is something that my great-grandfather wrote in 1875. He occupied that land, and he wrote the story out in a handwritten journal of his kind of his farm ledger. And I took the trouble, we still have it, my sister has it, I've transcribed it, unedited totally. So what I'm going to read to you is in actually the language of 1875, which I think is kind of interesting, and probably more interesting than me just telling the story. So here we go. In 1755, the French had a fort at the mouth of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers called Fort Duquesne. They had been in possession of this place for a long time, and by trading with the Indians and other ways had accumulated a large amount of gold and silver, which was intended to be shipped to France at some future time. At the time my story begins, all the country northwest of the Ohio River belonged to France and was called New France. England had been trying to get possession of this territory for a long time, and for that reason, Edward Braddock, with a large force of British and Indians, was sent to capture Fort Duquesne. The French, hearing of their approach, decided at a council of war then held that the treasure should be sent to some safe place under a small escort, while the main body of their army would attempt to hold the British in check till they could prepare for a final abandonment of the country there to follow after. This was the program, but like many others, was considerably changed. In the reading of the history of that time, you will see that they overestimated the strength of the enemies, that they not only held the British in check, but were well nigh annihilated the British army of which only a small portion being saved by the bravery of young George Washington, then an under-officer. The escort consisted of 10 men that was all but deemed possible to spare from the fort, and to them was assigned the dangerous duty of transferring the treasure to a safe place. They were given orders to bury it and mark the place if at any time they felt certain it was exposed to capture. And from the best authority we can get, the treasure consisted of 16 pack horses, loads of gold and silver. The sound of the battle had already broken on their ears before they were out of sight of the fort, which fact accelerated their march greatly. They took a westerly direction along what was afterwards known as the Tuscarora Path, and on the third day out, they saw what was supposed to be the advance guard of the British, and supposing, of course, their comrades at the fort were defeated, it was decided to bury the treasure, mark the place, and try to save themselves. The place they reached was 80 miles from the fort, and nearly exactly on the line between what is now Carroll and Columbiana County at a place called Watertown, on account of several springs put out but a few rods apart. This place is now owned by a Clayton Robbins who delights in telling what he knows of the story. The treasure was scarcely buried, and the places marked before they were attacked, and several were slain. Only 2 were ever heard of afterwards. Some of the marks left was a deer cut on a tree 1 mile east, a peculiar stone placed in the fork of a tree 11 feet up at a spring 1/2 mile west. The shovels used were hidden under a large log 600 steps north. There were several other marks such as Beaver Hat Spring and Cranberry Spring, and not designated. For some cause, the balance of the French army did not immediately follow, and when they did, not knowing the circumstances, and supposing, of course, the treasure was safe, passed by the place. They did find out that it had been lost, and not knowing the marks, could not find it. It was forgotten, it seems, except by one man, one of the 10 that helped bury it, and he kept it in his own breast, a secret, hoping at some time having the pleasure of digging it out and calling it his own. This man was a Scotchman by birth, and after numerous adventures and hairbreadth escapes, settled in North Carolina. He made a memoranda of the facts, and awaiting his time that it would be safe for his return. But that time never came. He died, leaving his memoranda with many other papers to his nephew. I will leave it to you to read the history of the United States and what happened to this country until 1829, when this nephew, in searching his uncle's papers, found the one regard to this affair. He immediately started to hunt it up, first procuring a good horse, a saddle, and a bridle, as there was no other way at that time for traveling, and armed with his papers, turned his face northwest. He landed at a Mr. Evans in this country that same year, this county being somewhat settled by this time. Mr. Evans lived in what is now Mr. Hines' farm, and from there he commenced his search. This was the first that had ever been heard of the hidden treasure in this country, and this man's inquiry raised the excitement to a fever heat. The Tuscarawas Trail had become a public road. Although several marks, such as this man wanted to find, were known, no one would tell him where they were thinking to find it themselves. He frequently offered his horse, saddle, and bridle to anyone who would show him the marks mentioned. He showed the memorandum of his uncle to several, but as it was written in Gaelic Scotch, very little would be made of it, not understanding the language. After a long search, he gave up in despair, went back to North Carolina, and never returned. The search was then pushed by several other citizens. All the marks mentioned by the Carolina man were found, though some were not found for several years, and then quite by accident. The remains of the shovels were found by Mr. Rigby on the farm now owned by Mr. Evans. The stone placed in the fork of a tree was found by John Whitaker. on a farm now owned by Mr. Clark. He was cutting a tree for rails, which in falling, split in two and falling astride another tree. From the growth of the wood, it was supposed that the stone had laid there for nearly a century. The deer on the tree, the springs were known, the remains, the muskets, and many other things were found on land brought into cultivation near this place. Mr. E. Whitaker found on his farm, near where the shovels were found, what was the appearance seemed to be the remains of a soldier by what at one time was a large log. A musket, bullet molds, scissors, screwdrivers, over a pint-ounce of musk balls were there. All but the balls were badly used up by rust. There were 3 or 4 other lots of relics found nearby at the same time in the neighborhood. They were supposed to be the remains of the escort killed at the time the treasure was buried. From time to time, holes were dug, no treasure was found. The divine properties of the witch hazel has been tried. Mesmerisms, spiritualisms have been invoked, but all failed. Dreamers dreamed of where it was, but they too failed to find it. One man sent to New York at great expense for a machine called a goldometer. This contrivance was said to be a sure thing. It was tried in the house where I now write, and several other places. Gold and silver was hidden by one man and found by another with the machine. It was now thought that the great problem would be solved, but when tried on the ground where the treasure was supposed to be, it too failed like all the rest. Everything failed. People have about quit talking about it when the Carolina papers seem to have gotten into another man's hand. He wrote to a man in Canton, Stark County, Ohio, by the name of Theo Halter to try and find the hidden treasure. He so worked on his imagination that he quit a good situation there for this purpose. A great deal of time and money was spent by this man in the search. This again raised an excitement. Numerous holes were dug from 5 to 20 feet deep, but the earth would not give up the treasure. Since this time, a great many more holes were dug, all with the same result. One hole dug by a very superstitious Negro who dreamed where it was. According to his belief, if anyone spoke to him while in search, it would spoil the charm. He was about to find the treasure when his wife spoke to him and spoilt the charm. He immediately abandoned the hunt, and the next morning he found his horse in the hole dead. This cured him of treasure hunting. Very little has been done in the past few years in the search. Mother Earth still holds the treasure and will, in all probability, until Judgment Day. T.L. Whitaker, March 1875.
1875.
1875.